Okay, great. I'm Lucy Kueng. I'm a senior research fellow at the Reuters Institute. I'm also a professor of media innovation, and I work on boards in media organizations also. And before we go any further, I want to introduce my colleagues on the panel quickly. So would you please introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Lyndsey Jones. I'm executive editor on the Financial Times. And basically what that really means is that I've headed up quite a number of change projects, deep change projects, and also felt the pain of change.
I'm Helje Solberg. I'm the news director of NRK, the public broadcaster. I've only been that for less than a year. Before that, I was 24 years with RISJ, VGTV, and Schibsted.
I'm Inga Thordar. I'm the executive editor for CNN Digital internationally. So I run a global team that looks after basically all the international news for all of CNN's digital platforms.
Okay, so firstly, I'm going to take about 3 minutes to set this up, and then we're going to turn it over to the wisdom of the panel, and then actually I'd really like to turn it over to the wisdom of this group here. I'm sure a lot of you have been involved in change projects, so we're really interested to hear your experiences, your question, but also best practice, please. This is a difficult area. So, first of all, where did this title come from? It sounds like clickbait, as a great colleague in the audience said to me last night. It is a real thing. Actually, a CEO said almost exactly a year ago to me, as he was surveying his domain, saying, Christ, we have so many chicken shit projects in this organization. I don't know where to start. I can't get any kind of strategic focus, strategic traction, because there's so much of this stuff going on. And a little bit later last year, I was working with another media organization, a very large one, that actually got to the point of having to bring in a team of consultants just to map the number of innovation and change projects in the organization at any given point. There were many, many that some were on the radar screen, some were off. And in fact, this problem with shiny new things, which comes from a very good place, it comes from everyone understanding the need to innovate, everyone understanding the need to change. If it's not kind of disciplined and done strategically, can have really bad consequences, kind of collateral damage around really diluting strategic focus, eating up resources, and adding to a huge amount of complexity. So the issue is actually, how do we grapple with this problem? And my current research I'm working on, which is kind of the sequel to Going Digital, which is a big report I published about a year ago that some of you may have read. This issue has kind of come up and hijacked, to some extent, that research. So what I thought I'd do is share with you the way I'm beginning to look at this problem very quickly, and then pass it on to my colleagues. So essentially, I think the challenge here, the first step, is recognizing that these shiny new things are just one dimension of the change that's happening in our organizations. So essentially, I think if we try and think from a helicopter view, what do media organizations, we can look at them as having three layers. The bottom layer is the kind of legacy layer. That's the layer that is still actually keeping the lights on for a lot of us. The traditional programs, the traditional products, the newspapers, the magazines, the primetime news programs everyone's watching. But the challenge there, kind of in terms of us as organizations, we really need to optimize that layer. There's not big innovation happening on that layer. We need to do it as well as we can. The real growth is in the middle layer, and that's the kind of digital layer. And that's all about there. That's all about growing. It's about growing audiences, ideally growing revenues as well. And then on the top, there's another layer, which is the future, which is all about exploring these new technologies, these new platforms, these new products. What could they offer for us? But I think the big learning or finding that's emerging for me is we need to kind of understand that within this context, there's kind of three buckets of innovation projects. And I think the really smart way to approach this is understand their three buckets, and that each of them need kind of different approaches and to do it well. So I would argue actually the shiny new things are one element of this. And if we look at those are focused kind of the digital and the above layers. And I think what's interesting about those is these are essentially experiments. They're about learning. It doesn't really matter if they don't quite work as we were intending to. We're trying to test the technology. We're trying to test a new option, trying to see what could that offer for us. They have collateral benefits as well, in that they are incredibly important to attract new talent into the organization, new digital talent, which we need. And the other thing I think they're really important for is building the profile of the organization. If you look at the narrative that organizations are putting out about themselves in the current climate, they're really shaping it around the shiny new things. They're not talking about the other types of projects. So it's very important for kind of building the organization's profile and building the profile of the individuals in that organization. But they're just kind of one corner, and you need very specific types of skills in those types of projects. The second type that emerges are actually the kind of big new strategic departures. And I was talking actually to the Washington Post about this just yesterday. And essentially, the way they look at these are essentially big bets. And to use Jeff Bezos' terms, they call these one-way doors, right? You can't go back. Once you've gone down the road of seriously going to subscriptions or seriously going to events, you don't want to be able to cycle that decision back. So they're different to the shiny new things. They actually have to deliver all the growth, the sustainability of the organization in the future depends on these working. So they're a kind of different thing, and to some extent, one of the really good learnings I've come up with in working on this is one of the best pieces of advice is this idea of you give the biggest rocks to the best managers. And these projects are really important actually for building the next generation of top managers. So a tip to you in the room, these are the projects to get involved in actually. But they're tricky because they kind of combine editorial and business and tech. And then the last group of projects, which is really the toughest, that get far too little attention and recognition, are the really deep change projects. And these are the ones that really transform legacy into kind of future-focused organizations. So these are things like really making organizations digital first, really prioritizing digital products over the existing legacy products. A lot of the organizations I'm talking to at the moment are doing very complex content reduction, less content, better content. They fall in this area, and these are always underestimated in terms of how long they take and how much they're going to cost. And they take a huge toll on the people working on them because you're working between old and new. You're permanently trying to transform people who really don't want to transform. So the people at the top are having a great time. But the people in this group, this is the really heavy lifting. But if this doesn't work, actually the transformation often doesn't play off. So that's kind of the kind of model I've been working with. And I'm sort of offering that up as a kind of framework to now dive into our kind of panelists' expertise. And actually want to start with Lyndsey here. And as you know, just as quickly, the Financial Times has really pulled into the lead of the leader group in recent years. I think just this week you announced you've hit your target a year early of 1 million paid subscribers. And you really have been responsible or deeply involved in a lot of the deep change projects there. So I think it would be really interesting if you could give us your kind of expert inside of you on how they arise, what they look and feel like from the inside, and what's really central to make sure they deliver what they should.
All right, so I fit in that deep change product bit that Lucy's just highlighted, absolutely, definitely. Well, what does it feel like? It was hell, but it was worth it in the end. I'm not sure if senior management ever factor that kind of thing in that Lucy's kind of touched on there, but yeah, change for me involved a lot of pain. But to get through that, the way I see it, I was a bridge between the CEO or Lionel Barber, the editor's vision in what they wanted the newsroom to look like or how they wanted the newsroom to operate, to actually the reality of how you get there. And in simple terms, there were a number of things that I did, which was, first of all, we simplified the print production process. Why that was key to changing the newsroom into a digital-first newsroom is because the newsroom was very much print-orientated, even just about 4 years ago. So we brought forward deadlines by 24 hours, and we changed working practices, and that took a lot of communication, a lot of negotiation, whether that was at union level or team level or actually just at individual level. And that went on probably for something like 18 months in terms of just talking to people, to persuade them, to influence them, to buy into this was necessary in order to get us into a digital future. Part of that pain was bringing forward deadlines by 24 hours. What that was geared towards was our peak audiences online, and that also involved building what we call a production schedule, broadcast schedule, which is times of publication for all our stories as to when we're going to publish them online, and we were very much targeting peak audiences in certain regions in order to get to this 1 million subscribers, and we do think that the broadcast schedule very much helped us along that path as well. Why was that painful? Because that kind of makes sense really when you just hear about it, but it involved all news desks in the whole of the FT, including the Saturday Magazine and FT Weekend, actually drawing up transparent story lists on what they were working on. So that was global transparency, so that people in the US and Hong Kong could also see what they were doing. But people like secret lists, they like lists in their heads, and actually we discovered there was a bit of interdepartmental warfare as well, where people was accusing other departments of nicking their stories. So we had to reassure everybody that it's absolutely fine, we'll get through this, you know, please, we do need transparency around stories so we can pick the best ones for the homepage, and that's where we are today. And I think I'll leave it there. Oh, content reduction. Yeah, one more time. Yeah. The FT is also looking at content reduction, and in the last year we've reduced the amount we've published by about 20%. That seems a lot, but actually there were a number of underperforming stories, what we targeted as underperforming stories. They generally lack engagement. People are not commenting on them. I don't know if anybody was here with the people before us, but there was a gentleman mentioned the conversation. News is now a conversation, and basically no one was having a conversation on some of these stories. And so actually our audience, our subscribers, have not noticed that we've stopped doing some of that content, the low-performing content.
Can you talk a little bit about how you deal with people that aren't too happy with these changes? I mean, because everyone had to buy into what you're doing, right? You had to get 100% buy-in.
We did it in a consensus-driven culture, and and there was a voluntary redundancy program, so we didn't make compulsory. So some people had the chance to think this is not for them, and they take some money and they go. And that happened with some people, but those that chose to stay, some of them were actually still resistant to change. And yes, there is an awful lot of persuasion that you have to do. Now that could be just me talking to one person. I had to do that quite intensively to quite a number of people actually, particularly around the broadcast schedule, where I sat with them and would keep going back to their desk until they would do it, until they were reassured that they really should share the secret list of their news stories and so on. Or at team level, when we were doing the print simplification, we had many, many meetings where we were reassuring people that the newspaper was very much at the heart of our news organisation, and this was not a measure to harm or damage the newspaper, because that would be the accusations that staff would reflect back to us. And I think we've demonstrated that now, because we won Newspaper of the Year last year in the UK, and that is a very big deal. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. If not, we could maybe... Should we jump to you, Inki, while we set up the slides?
Sure.
Let's do that. So I think, Inki, your career's unusual in that you've had experience of all three buckets, right? You've done the kind of sharp, whizzy, innovative things, the deep change, and the kind of big new growth. And so I kind of was hoping you could give a sense of how to toggle between the three, how to kind of master.
If only I had that sort of completely nailed. But listen, I mean, the thing is that, I mean, I work for a big, what we, would definitely describe as sort of legacy organizations. And with that comes, a lot of pluses. We have, you know, a good brand name, we've got good resources, we're capable of doing very good journalism. But, you know, the flip side of that is that, you know, we also operate still very much like a one platform, or when I started, we operated very much like a one platform operation, which has changed dramatically, I would say, in the last sort of 3 years or so, where we're really starting to think a lot more about it. But that's in that sort of, if you look at that sort of old bucket that Lucy was talking about, it's, you know, how do you change your workforce skills? How do you break down the silos inside the company? How do you get to the new growth, which is the digital? You have to first fix the old one. And then on top of that, for us in the digital sphere, the need for innovation is huge, not just in terms of us kind of bringing out our journalism in a different way, or, you know, doing different storytelling or something like that. It's also, it attracts better talent, it attracts better workforce, so it's a survival thing as well. But I think that perhaps the way to, you know, if you want to survive all three buckets, and I think that any editor in a legacy organization will agree that, you know, you have to have a skill set in all three of them, because you have to take part in the deep structural changes that have to happen, but you also have to be able to, you know, do the middle part, which is often around how do we distribute our content now, what is our new revenue model, you know, where are we going to, you know, how are we going to do journalism in a different way, a different kind of news gathering, and then how are we going to make that, sort of put that out in a creative way. And that's, it's hard to have all those skill set and all those opportunities and this possibility. So the role of an editor in a legacy organization has changed dramatically, I would say, in the last sort of 5 to 6 years, and you keep adding, you know, well, you have to keep adding strings to your bow to be able to deal with that. But I would say that, you know, going back to Lyndsey's point, the deep dive is the hardest bit. It is, you know, you don't see it, you don't get to put it out to audiences. So, you know, the slog that you have to go through to get to hopefully kind of that going lower down your priority order is hard and a lot of work. But that's where I would say an organization like mine needs to be focusing heavily on now. We need to be focusing on absolutely optimizing the old, but using those resources to get to the new growth area. But it requires a lot of strategic work behind the scene, and often is not as rewarding as when you put out an amazing piece of journalism that is really creative and really innovative, and the audience is responding to. So yeah, so I would, I'll leave it there for now. And
do you want to show your?
I'll do that later.
I'll get
Helje to
Can we
do.
Can we now switch to the other slide deck? Is that right?
Yeah. Oh, you had it up already. Oh, actually, if you have it up, I'll point out to this. I was going to sort of talk about, I mean, what is actually innovation and what falls into this top bucket. And I think that that's important to, we've always seen it as sort of like new projects away from the journalism, sort of like starting something on any of the platforms, or, you know, beginning something that is brand new, that is almost like an incubator within the company. But I think that what, you know, I have been really proud of what CNN's been doing is really start to think, whoa, I mean, CNN's known for breaking news, that's our USP, and we do that exceptionally well. But we also have incredibly talented journalists who are capable of a lot more than that. And this series, I don't know if you've seen it, where you can have a look at afterwards, cnn.com/JamesBrown. It took us 2 years to make. It's a 30,000 words piece in 3 parts, and it's about the death of James Brown and doubts that have been raised about him. And you wouldn't normally see a 30,000 word news piece. I mean, they're normally somewhere in the, you know, between 800 and 1,200 words. So you can imagine the investment that we'd had to put into this. And, you know, in the first week, we got about 3 million hits on this story with an incredible engagement. And to me, that's just as innovative, to show the capability of the organization beyond just what our USP is, as it is to start some new project on Facebook Watch or on, you know, Snapchat or any of the third platforms. So I think that, you know, we also have to start thinking innovation can also come in a different form, in a different format, that is just as valuable, just as important to the organization as, you know, perhaps what we would think of as more traditional shiny new things.
Great. Okay. Sorry, I think we're going to do it now. We got this.
I definitely want to see that thing on James Brown.
Yeah.
You know, well,
Yeah, no, please have a look at it. It's a really good piece of journalism.
does anybody want to shout a question out while they're just getting this sorted out? No? No questions? Oh, yes, there's a lady in red there.
Thank you. How did you get your newsroom comfortable with producing less content?
Right, actually, out of all the change projects, because I must admit, this was now my third change project, so I had a certain reputation by then. Yeah. And I worked with a senior news editor colleague, and what we did, because what was happening, Lionel would tell everybody, go out and do less, and they go, yes, 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 and then they go out and do more. And we realized they needed criteria, news editors needed criteria on how do you not commission a story that's going to underperform. And so for us, we started with 3,000 page views or less. That was just our starting point. And then we monitored those stories, and actually there were trends that started to emerge. One was that they got very few comments on, less than 5 comments, for example. They might be published at a certain point in the day, which was, let's say, Friday afternoon, when we know most of our readers are down the pub. So, in the end, we drew up a list of criteria, which now news editors have, to try and make those judgment calls by. And it's been effective. We have done it by 20% at the end of last year. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Are we ready to go? Okay.
I just want to introduce Helje, and I think a lot of us in Western Europe have looked on with awe at how the Norwegian media houses seem to be permanently ahead of the curve and also kind of do things really, what looks like effortlessly. And Helje, you have handled a couple of these deep change initiatives at VG and in your new role. So I'm going to hand over to you to explain about those. Do you want to come and sit here? Then you can use this microphone here.
Yeah, or do you hear me? Yeah. Let's try.
Okay.
Because
no?
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Okay. No, so when you want to do, is this okay?
It's fine.
So when you want to do something new, do something different, you have to add something new. That can be competence, people, technology, or mindset. But it needs to be a new ingredients. Otherwise, I will tell you what happened, and this is a warning. This is a moose in bronze. Perhaps hard to believe, but we have lots of them in Norway. This is from a hometown. A friend of mine, she commissions art in public spaces, and she says that this is what her customers want. This is something they understand and know. To buy a moose, it's a safe choice, and a moose in bronze is a good investment. How can this be wrong? More of the same. A premise in innovation is that you manage to change while moving forward. You test, evaluate, and adjust in the process. That's why it's so important to establish a learning culture and work exploratory. And it's not possible in advance to know that if your idea is so strong that it doesn't need any adjustments or just some minor ones. But in my experience, things end up quite differently than we expected. And I'd like to share with you some examples from VGTV. So in 2014, VG invested heavily in digital video. That was important in order to keep and strengthen VG's position as Norway's largest news site, online news site. VG is the largest online site and paper combined, and it reaches like 56% of the population every day. We also launched a linear TV channel. That was not successful. Today, that channel is filled with documentaries. We recruited photographers, journalists, producers, anchors. That was not flexible and dynamic enough. Today, everyone does everything. We made documentaries available for free online with a pre-roll in front. That wasn't possible to monetize. Today, the documentaries, more than 400, are the most important part of VG's premium paid product, and it has also made VG to experiment with purchasing TV rights. We made TV stories in the way TV has been made for decades. Today, it's mobile first, embracing the unique qualities of digital, making great internet, not bad TV. All of this is successful today. None of this was possible to predict in 2014. We would not have managed to be where VGTV is today without making lots of mistakes. And because it's not possible to know, as I said, in advance, how strong your idea is, or if you need to do adjustments, you have to think of two things, especially. That is risk assessment and mindset. Let me try to illustrate. Here is NRK's long-term strategy. It indicates an ambition. We don't know quite how to get there, but we have to start working on it. That's something very different than if you are building a hospital. Then you know exactly what to do. Change is not wanted. You want to reduce risks. You want to have control. If there are changes, it's about doing it more cost efficiency. While here, you need a different process. Then you have less control. It's about how many doors should you keep open, for how long. Change is desired and needed. But if you use the mindset that is required to build a hospital, you will just do more of the same. You will make another moose, perhaps a bigger moose, perhaps a more modern moose, but still a moose. All organizations have a moose in bronze. What decisions do we take that are just more of the same?
Great, thank you. Okay, we'd really like to. Oops. Sorry.
Furniture?
Are you okay?
Yes, I am.
Really be interested to hear Ashley's views from the room. I'm sure. How many of you work in media organizations right now? Okay, so you've all been involved in change projects, yeah? Okay, how has that experience been? Are there insights you have gained through that you would like to share, or questions you'd like to ask of us as a panel?
Well, yeah,
Oh, sorry.
I was wondering, sorry, did you point?
That's perfect. There's someone directly behind you, so don't know. It's perfect. Please carry on. Apologies.
Well, we are in the middle of a deep change project, and it's almost finished now.
Congratulations.
And what I see is that there is a problem now with because they tell us the 1st of June we're going over. We're going to be all new, and everything we talked about for about 2 years is put into place, and then we're going to do it. But now we are still working more or less in the old-fashioned way. And what you see is that, well, we still have to deliver for the website, for the television, for radio, but loads of people are already on the way in the new formats, everything, and talking for the last bit, and we hardly have no people left to do the work. How do you solve that problem?
Lyndsey, that's for you. Oh, Inki, you go ahead.
Well, I sympathize with that quite a lot. And do you know what? I think that different organizations are in a different way. And the difference probably between me and Lyndsey, and you'd mentioned television. Sorry, I don't know what organization you're from, but you know, I think the problem for us who are in the broadcast world, who are moving into the new, is that television is still an incredibly strong medium. You know, it's still pulling in a lot of revenue. It is still pulling in a lot of audiences. And I mean, you know, I know I don't have to tell this room that CNN is doing all right with Trump, you know. So, you know, for us to kind of make that shift like on the 1st of June is just too hard. So you end up having to serve the old for much longer, and therefore it's harder for you to change the skill set of the organization, because you still need to, you know, look at the part of the company that is still very profitable, that is still very of high value to the audience. So you can't make these quick changes. A lot of the time for the other legs around the papers and stuff, it happened quicker. And it hasn't happened like that for broadcast. So any digital sort of shift within the broadcaster is therefore much more cumbersome. It takes a lot longer, and it can't happen on the 1st of June for most companies. I mean, it doesn't happen that quickly. And then I think, though, what we forget when we're talking about change projects is that, I don't know how any other journalist feels in here, but I mean, the news cycle is relentless. So you're still having to do your job. You're having to come in, you're having to write your stories, you're having to produce your content. And I mean, I live in London. I mean, Brexit has killed us over the last 3 weeks, literally. You know, so we're doing 15, 16-hour days, and then while you're doing that, it is really hard to sort of think, oh, well, why don't we make a massive strategic change while we're at it? You know, that just ain't gonna happen. But so I think that there's a real difference between the urgencies of different companies to move, and therefore how quickly they can do it. But Lyndsey might disagree with me.
I'm not going to disagree. I'm just going to say, is that a joke, June the 1st?
No,
I mean, I'm laughing.
There have been talks for about 2 years now, and all the plans are there, and we know what we want to do.
Yeah, who's going to see them through?
Sorry?
Are you going to see them through? Who's going to see through the plans?
Loads of people.
Loads of people. So, in my experience, you need somebody who's takes charge of that. One person. Yeah, they're probably an executive editor, just saying. Yeah. Maybe, you know, from the FT, just saying. No, seriously, you need someone to oversee it and to enforce it. Yeah. There's an element of enforcement, and there's an element of facilitating. You'll find, I think you sort of mentioned some people have already run away with it and are already doing the new things. Yeah. They'll be really making all the people who are resistant really angry, thinking, what the hell are they doing buying into that when we've got Brexit or Trump or whatever else and all these other stories? Are they mad? So, yeah, you're going to need to bridge all of that stuff. Yeah.
So good more luck. A transitional kind of period. For
probably a couple of years.
Okay.
That's not a joke. That's not a joke. Every change project I've done, apart from the content reduction thing, and that's still a work in progress in some ways, taken 2 years at least.
Thanks. So I was involved in a change project in a Dutch newspaper. A very old and legacy traditional newspaper, a great one actually, but so a difficult project. What we figured out was that if we gave speeches in larger rooms where dozens of reporters would be present, and we would actually make a joke and show some beautiful slides, everybody would sort of be on board, not ask some polite questions, and then leave the room and bitch about it. Yeah. So that wasn't really helpful at all to actually get that change going. What I then started doing afterwards was invite people selectively from the newsroom, a newsroom of 200 people, and then invite 3 or 4 people from various departments and just have lunch with them and ask the question, what do you actually want here? What do you think that, where should we be going? Then they would always come up with the answer themselves. So basically it was like a grassroots way of figuring stuff out, and that was really not time efficient, but very helpful in the long run. So I'm really actually looking forward to hearing more of those smaller tips. So
Yeah,
if you have a couple of those.
I think that's really interesting what you're saying there, because you've hit it on the head. When I've talked about communication, actually, one part of that, the really massive one, was listening. Listening to what, and it could have been at a team level, it could have been smaller. I did have individual meetings as well. But really listening to people's fears and concerns around change and trying to address that. And you want to come back to me, I can see that.
Yeah, because now, while you're saying this, I'm thinking there's actually a great book that helped me get some sleep back again. It's called, I would love to recommend to everybody, it's called The Guide to Office Politics. It's actually the real title. It's within the series of the Harvard Business Review, The Guide to Office Politics, and suddenly it all makes sense.
Great, I'm going to make a note of that.
I can add a bit to that. I think, when you're trying to shift a skill set from, saying we need to move from doing everything like this to everything like that, I 100% agree with you that doing a little bit sort of a smaller group, one-on-one, where you can deep dive a little bit, but that comes down to also education, So in my group, it's like I've had to sit down with television people and say, data is really important. And they're like, what? International television doesn't have data. So I've sat down with them and I've showed them, here's your piece that you did, here's how it performed, this is why it performed well, this is why it didn't perform as well, this is, and ultimately, certainly in the TV world, a lot of the journalists, they really want people to see their stuff. So if you can give them those tips, if you can say, give me a better headline and I can, push it better out on any distribution platform. But it's time consuming. But normally if you get to your 10%, that's what we'd call, if you get your 10% evangelists in each group, that will spread. But getting to those 10% can be pretty hard. But I found that really giving them my time and taking the effort to educate them around why the story that they normally didn't do well actually pays off in the long run. But I appreciate the time, resources that go into that.
Yeah, no, George Bernard Shaw had a point, I think. He said that the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And as managers, we again and again underestimate the need to communicate with the staff. And sometimes some organizations are resistant to change, creativity, and innovation, but most of the times, this is perfect and normal reactions to change. It's because the change has impacts their life.
Hi, I'm Ros from the BBC. I'm involved in quite a big change project at the BBC, and what I notice is that even though my day-to-day work as a TV journalist is quite pressured, the change project's much more emotionally draining. It's much more exhausting than the pressure of day-to-day work. And I'm interested in getting your advice and your thoughts on how you support people who are involved in change projects, who on a daily basis are coming up against quite personal and quite passionate resistance.
I think this is a really interesting point. I've been looking at this a lot because I'm really intrigued in this phenomenon of if you get a few high-profile change resistors, and then they sort of build a small faction of people that don't get it, they can be incredibly disruptive to the process. So I think one of the things is actually taking a step back, just you taking the emotion away. It's very hard if these people are really draining and being very difficult, but try and analyze, where do these individuals sit? Is it a hopeless case, in which case there's one set of actions? If it's not, then thinking about the various persuasion and communication tools that have been discussed. I think it's also important to two things. Firstly, people take in messages in different ways. It's like different learning styles for kids. And one of the most important tools I've seen is they won't take it from an person inside the organization, but a peer who they respect in a similar organization who's gone through a change, they will listen to. And it's a really strange mechanism. So from that point of view, if there is a parallel organization who's pulled off a similar change, get highly regarded people in to talk to your people. And somehow people are more open to that. they kind of, somehow the political dimension dissolves of that. But I think you're right, it's really emotional, and I think the emotional dimension of all of this is massively, you know, all the analyses are really rational, but these are really emotional projects, emotional events. Yeah.
I think it's extremely important to create a safe climate. I sometimes say that if we make decisions on a scale from 1 to 10, most of the decisions we take are between perhaps 5 and 7. It's not that often we make 9 and 10 decisions, and then we should avoid the 1 and 2. But as managers, we must make space and allow the staff to move on that scale, and not always expect them to perform their best. Perfection is not the goal, because if perfection is the goal, it gets too dangerous to fail, and the space gets too narrow, and failing is such an important source of moving forward.
If I could just come in on that as well in terms of support through change. In my personal experience, I had 100% support from Lionel Barber, the editor, and other senior managers. And without that, I don't think we'd be where we were today in terms of the change projects I had to go through. Also, I think you have to develop, as the manager, your own personal resilience. You have to become completely resilient. People are going to resist you. This is just the way it is. And you have to develop a coping mechanism. For me, it was cycling quite a lot. I did actually get quite fit. Yeah.
We've got place for a few more quick questions. I think I'm going to group them. Could you ask yours and then you, and then we'll take the next two? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Douwe. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm a teacher in journalism, and also doing my master's in learning and innovation. And I was thinking about there's a lot of theory about how people learn, and what disjuncture, the role of disjuncture in learning. So learning only starts when there is a situation where you are, blown away by the new possibilities, or so you have to change your mindset. You're talking about it. And my question is, what use do you make of learning theories? Because a lot of things you talk about are quite normal in learning theory. And I hear also something about the appreciative inquiry, which is a method to make people be a part of a change project. What use do you make of those kind of techniques, which are proved to be good change methods?
Great. Do you want to add about us?
Okay, I'm Fatma Farag, and I run a local media company in Egypt. All right, and whenever I attend sessions and have discussions about innovation and development and change within the organization, it's always about big organizations with big resources and the time frame to strategically plan years ahead. So what if you're working within a context where you are a small media company with limited resources, and the emphasis is always on surviving because you're in a context where you're not really sure whether in 6 months legally you're going to be able to perform or not. And part of your survival is also being able to innovate and change. And we're in the process now of content reduction and storytelling change process. And it's so frustrating because of everything that you've said, plus the added stress of we have a new law and we don't know whether we can actually function this way and whether we'll survive another few days. So do we really need to add on all of that complication into our daily work? So basically, is there a model for these processes that takes into consideration that there isn't always the time and the resource to think it out and communicate and work through it, I guess.
I think I can take Fatima's question. I must admit, I don't have an experience of working in a small company, but all the things that you talked about, resources, time, strategy, actually is a joint problem. Big companies do more, and therefore their resources are stretched just as thin. I guess what I would say is that turning a big tanker always takes a lot longer than turning a smaller ship, but I appreciate the the survival question, sort of point you raised, because I do think that, I mean, that this is the fundamental issue for journalism as a whole, is the survival question. And can you, if you pivot as a small company and you fail, well, that's you done. If you pivot as a big company, you have the opportunity to resurrect or sort of like, oh, well, take a hit on that one and move on. So there's a different sort of mindset in terms of that not everything you do has to be, you know, to Helje's point, perfect. Whereas smaller companies, you know, you could be literally betting your business on the strategy that you're heading down. So you have to get it right. But I would definitely say that what we share as big organizations with small is the resource issue, the possibility of doing things and the changes. That is just as acute for us, I would say. And then you're also probably grappling with a much stricter and more complicated hierarchy that has built up over years, if not decades. And you're having to kind of break that down, which I think is a little bit less stressful in big, smaller organizations where you might be able to have those conversations. And you add in like in my case, the global dimension, and you know, you add a yet more layer of complication around that.
I think just two really practical things. Firstly, I think, ironically, it's like, you know, when you really need to meditate is when you feel least like doing it, you feel most under stress. I think in your particular really challenging environment, you have to permanently reflect with your key team, what are our priorities right now, or perhaps 6 months ahead. And really, really important to do retrospectives from any decision you make. Remember, what were the assumptions we made? How did they pan out? And what you're trying to do is, in a quick and dirty way, set up a set of governing principles for you in terms of making these decisions. And I think you need to go into that mode, very practical, set up our governing principles, test them and refine them. And if that works, if you have the ability to make that work, then you have quite a kind of powerful language in your team and set of rules that maybe will speed up decision making in the future. But it's difficult to do it from that environment. And just quickly, in terms of appreciative inquiry, it's a fantastic approach. I think for each of those three buckets, essentially they're different techniques. So up in the shiny new things, definitely agile is a brilliant way to go forward. Appreciative inquiry is fantastic for those deeper change projects, if you have the luxury to do it. You know, there was a lot of that in the media before digital hit, but now that's kind of being crowded out by sheer existential questions. I think we might have time for just one more question, but then we probably, yes, at the back.
Oh, thank you. I was wondering how you incentivize maybe younger journalists in newsrooms to join these projects, because when I was a trainee, I was always told to do the live blogging, the data journalism, the podcast, you know, this sort of whatever the fashion was that month. Younger journalists were just told, we need to do this, do something. It's sometimes dispiriting when then that fashion changes and there's the next thing that you have to adapt to. Also, from a freelance perspective now, I see that digital journalism is still much more poorly paid than legacy media, and that can be even within the same organization, you can get paid a lot less if you do a digital piece than if you do a piece for the print edition. I was just wondering how you incentivize actually joining these change projects and giving young journalists the opportunity to feel that if they join them, it's worth doing it and that they're being invested in.
Quickly, I'm sorry because we're running out of time. I think essentially it's a self-selection process. I think you know instinctively where your skills and talents lie. I mean, the kind of agile type of work and the kind of shiny new things suits one type of personality. It's, and I think really the challenge also for managers is, you know, not all people have the same talent profile palette. And I think, you know, what's happened, I think, in newsrooms is that managers are actually having to be really smart people managers as well. And I think it's a task of putting the right people on the right projects. I mean, one of the deep change projects could really burn out a very committed journalist who doesn't have the resilience, right? So you need to kind of be sophisticated, understand who you are, what your strengths are, also what interests you. I mean, if you're going to be strategic about your career, clearly getting tied into one of these projects is a really good way to build your profile. So there is a cost. Yes, it could be a bit painful, but you could end up with a good result. You could have fantastic learning and a lot of portable skills. So I think it's an issue of looking forensically at these different types and seeing where do my strengths play best, actually. Okay, thank you all so much. I'm sorry we didn't get to Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope we didn't break your leg again.
No.
Am I supposed to push this?
Digital age. It will enable new models for sustainable journalism, elevate quality journalism, and ensure that technology allows journalists to do their jobs even better.